Right, good evening, everybody, to this evening's last talk of 2021. Going to be talking about in-computer photo workflow. So what I do with my images after I've shot them, when I download them off the camera and onto my computer, what happens to them in the processing to actually generate them, turn them from basic raw files into stunning, amazing pieces of photography and works of art. And so on. Or hopefully that's what we get. And obviously in this short period, less than an hour, I'm not going to be able to go into huge amounts of detail. And also, I should say that I'm not a massive expert on the programs that I use, in the sense I don't know every nook and cranny and every button and every option. I know how it works for me, and I use the features that I like to use. And beyond that, I'm afraid I'm not hugely expert, so it's quite possible that I won't know the answers to all the questions that come up. But that's probably just as well, because if I did, we'd probably be here all evening. So I'm just going to sort of, inevitably, it's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the way that I go about processing my images. But hopefully you'll get a reasonable idea, a reasonable picture of what goes on here behind the scenes. So the work I do involves three programs, which is Adobe Bridge, Adobe Photoshop, and Capture One Pro. Now, the Bridge is used as a kind of file handling system, which lists everything and which enables me to caption and copyright the images and so on, and to sort of keep an eye on what's going where. It's not really a database as such, but it's the software that I use to manage the images and manage all the folders and where all the images are filed and so on. And that works pretty well for me. As I say, it's not really a database as such, but it works well enough for my purposes. It comes along with the Adobe Photoshop package if you have the monthly contract with Adobe. And then the second program I use is Capture One Pro, and this is a software which is primarily for converting raw images into JPEGs or TIFFs. So it's primarily a raw processing software. You can also process JPEGs and TIFFs through it, but its primary usage is for processing raw files, which everything I shoot is shot in RAW. I don't shoot in JPEG at all, but everything I do is in RAW. So everything has to be processed through Capture One initially to create a TIFF file at the initial image. And the reason I use Capture One rather than Adobe's own RAW converter is because it feels like a much better software. It's a bit more complicated, but it works extremely well, and it's also incredibly good at delving into deep shadows and bright highlights to pull up any details. So if you've got any images with high contrast in them, then it's a really good software to use, and I feel that it's actually rather more effective than Camera Raw, than Adobe's Camera Raw. I have made a couple of comparisons between Adobe Camera Raw and Capture One, and they do produce rather different results, it's true, and I do usually prefer the results of Capture One. Anyway, so firstly, the images, when I download them, they go into, I view them in Bridge, and I caption them and copyright them and keyword them as well, and organize them and make an initial selection. And then those that I've selected to process, then I go into Capture One, and they get worked on and get converted from the worked on files into TIFF files, and then those TIFF files get run through Adobe Photoshop for final cleaning up and conversion from a 16-bit file to an 8-bit file, which I'll explain what that means in a minute. So it's a three-step process through Adobe Bridge, and then into Capture One Pro, and then finally into Photoshop, where I finish off the images. So that's what I'm going to try to do now, just to show you step by step. I'll start initially by showing you Bridge. This is what Bridge looks like. It's basically, as I say, on the left you have a list of all your folders you have on your computer. On the computer, at the moment, I've got open a folder which is a set of images that I selected to demonstrate to you today. I'm not going to demonstrate all of these, just going to demonstrate a small selection of them, but I pulled these up as possibly interesting shots that will give a bit of good demonstration on what I do. And then over on the right, we've got the preview, which is where we see the image, and then also metadata, which tells us everything about the image, all the embedded information about the image. Up here, we've got sort of the most important information up on the left here. So aperture f4 is a 13-second exposure. I overexposed by 1 stop, and the ISO was 2000. So this is the kind of thing you might expect really from a shot taken at night, showing even if it is showing northern lights. And then down here you have all sorts of other data about when it was taken, my name and address and copyright information. And then further down you have all the information about the camera and the lens that was used and whether or not the flash fired and so on. So it's a lot of information there in the metadata. And then over here you have keywords which you can build up yourself into a library of keywords and add to the image that you're processing. I haven't actually done that at the moment. I've kept the keywords section there, but I don't actually use it very much at the moment. But that's there if you need it. There are a number of other things which I don't display. This is set up to suit my own work process. There are a number of other things. If I look at window over here, you'll see there are a number of other options here to show other windows as well. But those are windows I don't use. So this is just the ones that I use here. The folders, the content listing images that are in any one of the folders, and then over here the 3 preview, metadata, and keywords. So for me, those are the important points. So in terms of what happens when I download images from the camera, you download the images from the camera using the camera plugged into the computer with a cable, and I use Canon's EOS utility software to download the images. That using Canon's own bespoke software for the download process ensures that I do get all the data that is embedded in the camera. So I believe that sometimes if you don't use the camera manufacturer's own software, then you may not get all the data over, but I'm not sure whether that's true or not. But I just use the EOS utility, and then once everything's downloaded, I then pull it all up in Bridge. These images are actually on the internal hard drive. When I download images from the camera to the computer, they don't actually go onto the internal hard drive, they go onto an external hard drive, and from where I then caption and keyword them, and then I back them up onto a second external hard drive. So generally speaking, the raw files don't rest on my computer's internal hard drive, they go onto an external hard drive, and then once I've captured, keyworded, and selected them, then they all get backed up onto a second external hard drive before I then start processing the images as raw files. So if I right click on this image, when we look at file info, this is a kind of where the image, what's called the IPTC data is entered into the image. Each image is all the way through, and there's a lot of data which I enter myself, which is common to all photographs, like the name, my name, my copyright information, my website address, and so on. And that can be put in using a template. And I have what's called down here a standard template, which is the template I put in to every image, and I don't put it in one at a time. What I do is I select whole batches of images, maybe the whole folder very often, and put all that basic information into the file info in one go using my template. What I then do is finally put in the information for put in the information for the caption in the description here. So that's the kind of the last step. So that may take a little bit of time, because obviously if you've got a lot of different images with a lot of different subject matter, then you could have different descriptions all the way through. So once I've done that, I then will make a selection and decide which ones I'm going to process. You can in Bridge have a star rating system, which is here somewhere. If we go in under label, it's something that I don't really use. I prefer to actually physically separate the images that I'm going to process from everything else. So I just drag them across into another folder, which I usually mark as selection. So the star rating is something that I don't usually bother to use. But I know an awful lot of people do. But as I say, I prefer to actually completely separate the images I'm going to process from the ones I'm not going to process and put them into a separate folder that I call selection. So basically, the images are either in or out. There's no sort of varying degrees of how good they are. It's just they're either in or out. So once I've done all this, then I move on to look at the pictures in Capture One. This is Capture One Pro. It's a little bit intimidating when you first look at it, but this is the software that I use for processing raw files. And to sort of what you need to look at just really is these icons over here near the top left. Initially, that's all we need to look at right now. And the first one on the left is really just series of folders. So as with Bridge, you have a series of folders that tells you everything that's on the computer. And here we have the photo workflow folder I showed you just now on Bridge, and that's just showing up the images in the folder display down the right-hand side here. All right, so the second icon is for photographing with the camera tethered to the computer, so you can actually run the camera from the computer and shoot using the computer, and the images then will download directly from the camera onto the computer. So this is really quite a useful thing if you're shooting in a studio and want to download the images immediately as you're shooting them. And then the third icon is a section for determining what kind of lens you've used. So embedded in Capture One Pro is a lot of information about a lot of different lenses, and it will automatically detect what lens you've used and will then put in corrections for chromatic aberration and so on and so forth, and other forms of distortion and so on. And then there's also other options down here. One of the most useful of which is Keystoning. That is the correction of your converging parallels. For example, if you're in architectural photography, and I'll certainly be showing you that in just a minute. And then this one, the next one, fourth across, is correction of color balance. This is actually very detailed and you can very closely control the change of color balance. If that's a bit too much, then this one is the one I use most of the time. This is the most commonly used section. This controls all sorts of information here. At the top, we've got the basic characteristics. It tells me I'm running Capture One Pro, and that the profile is come from this camera, the 5D Mark II. And then here I can change the color balance. I don't have to use the icon I showed you just now. I can change it here, and I can make all sorts of alterations to the exposure and saturation. And then these controls here are really useful for high dynamic range. This is where I actually delve into deep shadows or bright highlights. And then these two histograms here are for making alterations to the histogram of the image coming onto the computer, and the histogram at the top is the resulting histogram that I get at the end. So these two histograms are for controlling the image as it comes into Capture One Pro is not necessarily exactly as it was when I viewed it in the camera. The Capture One Pro sets various default settings, which invariably are not really right. So then they're having to make changes, and I make those changes very often using these two histograms here. And this histogram at the top tells you how the final histogram will look once I actually process the image. So this is the area. This icon here is the one I use most of the time. And then the next one is for sharpening, mostly noise reduction if I use, say, a high ISO or very long exposure, and then putting in film grain if I were to want to do that, and then removal of spots from the picture. That's just quite obviously useful thing if you've got spots across the image, bits of dirt on your sensor, for example. And then the next thing I use occasionally is the information, which again is the metadata. And then finally, this section is for actually processing the image. When you hit the process button up here, this will actually then convert your raw file into a TIFF file, and there are various menus or various programs for actually what you end up with. And what I have my images set on is to create a 16-bit TIFF file using Adobe Rgb as the color management system. Now, every color management system is really important because you go from the camera to the computer to someone else's computer. So publishing, as my files frequently do, then every computer along the way, from the camera through to the final published product, the images have to look the same. So the ICC color management profile is really important for demonstrating how, or just telling the computers along the way how all the colors should look. So it's really important that first you have your monitor correctly calibrated, and that you have embedded in every file, every image, the right ICC profile, color profile, to actually pass on so that your computers and your camera to know exactly which color is which and how they should be rendered. There are primarily two color profiles in use, widely in use, as sRGB and Adobe Rgb. Default on almost all cameras is sRGB, which is useful for working on the internet and so on. But Adobe Rgb is the standard profile if you're doing anything for publication. So if you're involved in publishing, as I am, then you will always be using Adobe Rgb, and this is the one that most professional photographers would use. But your default setting on the camera will be sRGB, and that would be what you would want to use all the way through in your software as well. If you're going to use sRGB on your camera, then you'll keep all your in-computer software on sRGB as well. The reason for switching to Adobe Rgb is it has a wider color gamut, so it captures more colors than the sRGB it does. But sRGB is fine for the internet and so on, but not so great for publishing. So the resolution is 300 pixels per inch. That's the publishing resolution rather than the internet, rather than website and internet resolution, and so on. So that's all the data that I have installed for the final processing of the image. So having completely bamboozled you with all that, I'm going to just go up here and now and just actually this image that I'm showing you at the moment is zoomed in. So this image I'm showing you is one I've already processed. I just did it earlier today just to check that everything was working okay. So this is obviously an internal shot, and this is how the image is how I would like them to come out. I'm not sure if I hit reset whether we end up getting, yes. So that was the original image. You can see it's a very different kind of thing. If I go back to this section here, the image I think is really too yellow. So I want to tone down that yellow color a bit. And I'm going to increase the saturation because I think this looks a little bit flat. So just turn it up a tiny bit. And then I want to tone down the highlights. The highlights of the lamps here and on the white wall are a little bit too bright. So tone that down slightly. So you're not going to get this toned down completely. You really wouldn't want to. Now, the next problem now is we've got some deep shadows. We've got really deep shadows here. So we go on this shadow section and we scroll this up to the right, and that pulls up the shadows, which is really just fantastic. Got some really deep shadows down here. If I wanted to also call up the black. So if anything's completely black, it will actually call that up. I don't like to use that too much because it makes the sections that call up there go very grainy. I don't really want to do that if I can help it. Next thing to do is to make sure that the histogram up here is not knocking against the ends completely. We don't want anything completely white if you can help it, although of course these lights up here are going to be white, but we don't really want them knocking up against the end here. So we pull in the end limpers a little bit. If I do this down here, you'll see the top histogram at the top actually moves slightly to the left. So that's what I'm trying to do there. And I will do that a little bit on the left here for the shadows, although actually there isn't really any need to, is there? So the image is looking slightly flat, so I'm going to just tone down the mid-tone slightly with using this histogram down at the bottom here. And then something that I do as standard right at the bottom here is just put in a little bit of sharpening just to make sure that we got things sharpened. And then back to this graph here, if you can see my arrow, I'm just going to, this also tones down the mid-tones and it brings it to cover the contrast down a little bit better. So now we get a picture where our shadows are not too deep and our highlights are not too strong, and it's looking like a much better image. What we've done basically is decrease the contrast range so we can actually make everything visible. Now for final little bit of magic, we go to this icon, the third on the left here, to this one, and we do a little bit of the keystoning. And as vertical keystone, see at the moment the camera is pointing downwards a little bit to show the tables. So what's ending up is that walls are leaning outwards, as you can see with these with the cupboards and the wall here on the right and the cupboard on the left. So I'm going to use this vertical keystone. I'm going to slide it to the right. I think it's to the right. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. Sorry. So you have to do it automatically, you see. I don't even think about it. So go slightly to the left, and then just a little bit of magic now. With the help of the grid, it tells me where it should be. And that's probably about right. So now I have a completely corrected image, which just makes life so much easier. And now we have, that's the image that I was hoping to come up with. So the next image is kind of a similar sort of idea, so I won't repeat that. But what we'll do now is a landscape, a nighttime shot taken in Iceland. We'll work on this image. As you can see, we've got some vignetting in the corners, which is quite a common problem with the lens I've used on this for this picture when it's wide open. So I'm going to, right at the bottom, we've got a vignetting tool, so I'm going to slide that to the right, and that will open up that a little bit. And then also, if we look at the histograms here, they're well over to the left, so we can probably increase the exposure a little bit and pull that in, and I would pull that, the shadows across slightly as well. So now it's looking a little bit too bright possibly. So we take the mid-tone here on the graph down here and slide that down. If I'm going too fast, just tell me. And then I'll put up a little bit of the sharpening. So now we have an image which hopefully is a little bit, you can see on the image, if I increase the contrast a bit, you can see that there's a little bit of northern lights in this picture, not a great deal, but a little bit there, which we can just about see. And sliding the histogram across to make it wider opens up the various colors so that we can see an awful lot more. I'll just move on to the next image. I see this, we have a real problem here with very dark pony and bright sky. So I see as a result, we've got this histogram, bright peak on the far right, darkness on the far left. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tone down the highlights on that shot, to bring that far right-hand peak in from the right, and I'm going to lighten the shadows to lighten that pony. So that gives us somewhat better picture. The sky is a little bit featureless, which is a bit of a shame. Sometimes you don't actually know whether it's going to be featureless or not until you do lighten it, but these things happen. So that's that kind of image that I would like to have. I'm just going to do one, just maybe do one more image down here. Actually, that's let's do that image, this image here. We got here classic sort of situation of photographing a holiday let with a window visible in the background. Quite a difficult situation to actually get the room correctly exposed and also hopefully get light outside. So what I'm going to do is, with the high dynamic range, I'm going to tone down that highlight there, and with the shadow, I'm going to lift the shadows. So we've got that looking a whole lot better now. I'm going to increase the saturation slightly. Also, the color temperature probably is okay. It's a little bit yellow in the dining room in the distance, so I might just turn the color temperature down ever so slightly. And now we have a picture where things are looking a lot better. Also, the histogram goes right up to the edges, so I'm going to pull that in slightly, and I'm going to lift this graph a little bit to actually make those white walls actually genuinely white, increase the contrast a little bit, put in a little bit of sharpening, and then I go back to this area, to the keystoning, and oh, gone the wrong way again, and straighten this image up, hopefully. So now we have a nicely processed image. Doesn't look dark and dull. The window's not burned out anymore, and all those sloping walls are now nice and straight, parallel and vertical. I'm just going to do one more very quickly, and then I'll process into Photoshop. So this is a classic sort of situation, a nice Icelandic waterfall, but deep, it's very dark in underneath the cliff, and the outside is really very, very bright. So again, what I'm going to do is the color temperature is kind of okay. The graph goes all the way across. We've got very high contrast range, possibly a bit of burnout there, we shall see in a moment. So go down to the high dynamic range, the highlights turn down to the left, and the shadows I crank up to the right. And now suddenly we have an image which is if not perfectly exposed, then an awful lot better than it was. And then also in doing that, we brought the edges of the histogram in as well. The shadow end is still a little bit right up against the end there, but I'll fix it like that. And then we'll move the mid-tones. And then, so there we have, like, increasing the contrast slightly after I've actually already decreased the contrast by doing the high dynamic range, then increase the contrast a bit so I get the contrast in places that I want it to be. All right, so I think I've done quite enough there. The next thing to do actually is, you see, if you look at these pictures on the right here, the bottom right-hand corner, got this little square on the ones that I've processed. So I know that they're the ones I've processed, so I'm going to select those. Didn't process that one. I processed that one, and I processed that one, and I processed that one. All right, so we're going to move those along now. And actually, what I'm going to do is going to go straight on to, well, in this section, I often, not always, but quite often add a little bit of sharpening. So although I've got 5 images highlighted, selected, only one image, if I make changes now, only the changes will only go to this one image. And then whatever changes I make to this image at the bottom here, which has got the white box around it, I then have to copy those changes into the other 4 images. And we do that, say if we do it with the sharpening, I choose an option to have moderate sharpening, and that gives me those settings there to actually help sharpen this picture. And if I want to move those settings to or copy those settings to the sharpening settings to those other 4 images, I then click this little icon here, and that tells me what we're going to copy over, and I apply it. Now those other 4 images have had that bit of sharpening applied as well. So now I'm going to go to the conversion section. I've already selected the folder that I want these pictures to go to, which is I called it TIFF files, which is inside the photo workflow folder. And I've already got the recipe, the menu, if you like, selected that I want to use. So I'm just going to hit process, and now it will start processing images. Those it does it very, very quickly. So now it's finished. Already it's finished all those images. So now the next stage would be to go into Photoshop to finish these images off. So I'm going to unshare the screen and then reshare with showing you Photoshop. So if I just share Photoshop, if I can show the right one, that's the one we want. Okay, so get rid of that now. This is what Photoshop looks like, and what I would normally do is actually would go into Bridge and pull the pictures up from Bridge. But if I do that, we're going to have sharing problems. So I'm going to open it from Microsoft's from the Bridges file section. So if I look at, so I'm going to, excuse me while I just find these pictures. Right, photo workflow. Right. Okay. So now, so all right. So there are all the images listed there, and actually those are the raw files, aren't they? Of course, I want to go into there. The TIFF files. So here are the TIFF files that I've converted. So I will go through each individual image and call them up like that. So this is now a TIFF file. This is no longer the raw file. This is now the sort of the almost finished artwork, if you like. And I think what I would often do here is tweak the contrast and the saturation. That's, I think, don't need to do that with this particular image. I think it's all looking fine. The other thing I would do here is check it for any bits of dirt and dust that come over from the camera sensor. So I would blow the image up to 100%, and then I work my way across, and I use the healing brush tool, which is on the tool on the left here, to remove bits of dust. So here we have a little spot here. That's a shadow created by a bit of dust that's on the camera sensor. So we remove that. There's another one there. So I'm actually just doing this a little bit randomly. So actually this, well, it's got quite a dirty sensor here today. So what happens is that the dirt that's on the sensor shows up much more clearly if you've used a wide angle lens and a narrow lens aperture. And that's if you're doing interiors photography. that's precisely what you're doing most of the time, is using a wide angle lens, a very narrow lens aperture to give you a big depth of field. And so any bits of dirt that are on the sensor will show up really strongly. This kind of thing here, this is kind of optional. It's actually is part of the scene, and I may opt to remove it if I want to, or if the client wants me to, I might remove it, but it is part of the scene, so it ought to stay there really. All I'm really looking for to remove is these little bits of sensor dust, and what I'm doing is just the healing brush tool is just measuring what is around that little splodge, and then just replacing that splodge of dust with similar kinds of pixels that are around it. So that's what I would do. So I would go through the whole picture like this. It's quite tedious, and if you've got several hundred images to process, it can take a very long time, especially if you've got a dirty sensor and it's not. And it will take a long time if it's showing up everything. So that's what I would do. I'm not going to go through everything. What this is showing is that it's not completely, it's interesting. It's not completely corrected. It's still a little, some things are still leaning out a little bit, but I'm not going to worry too much about that. So that's, if I were to go through the whole image, removing any splodges that are visible, it would take me quite a while. They're mostly visible in things like a white ceiling and a white wall, or in the table and the covers, it doesn't really show so much. The final thing to do is this 16 here. This is shows that I'm using a 16-bit file. Usually we work in 8-bit files, which means 8-bit meaning that every byte of data is then contributed around it by, or every bit of data then has set data from another 8 bits all around it to create 1 byte of data. If you have a 16-bit file, then it's actually 16 bits all around each bit to create 1 byte of data, if that makes sense. So while you can't create JPEGs using 16-bit files, only TIFF files. So we want to convert that 16-bit to 8-bit. So going into image and then mode and then 8 bits, and now that becomes an 8-bit file, and then I can save that, and that's that one done. So if we go then continue, and we'll look at this one now. This is a nighttime shot, of course, and what we have here is a sloping horizon. So what we need to do is correct that horizon. So what I'm going to do is call up my line tool, what's called a line tool, a ruler tool, I should say, ruler tool. And if I actually enlarge the image a little bit, then I can put my ruler tool along here. I won't go across the island, I'll just leave it there like that. And then I'll go to image, rotation, arbitrary, and it tells me how much it needs to be rotated. So in this case, it's 0.95 degrees and it goes clockwise. If I hit OK, it now rotates the image, and we have an image with a straight horizon. The only problem now, of course, it's rotated, so we've got these white areas, and the only what I have to do now is lose some of the images, which is always slightly frustrating, but that happens quite frequently. One of the problems with doing absolute nighttime shots in complete darkness is that you really can't see what you're shooting half the time. So that's the crop tool I've employed, just to actually remove those white areas. And if I hit enter now, that gives me the nicely straightened image. I'm going to also change the image is a little bit too dark for my liking. So if I hit Control N, I can bring up the curve, and that will, I'm going to pull that in there like so, and that will light the image. I'm going to increase the contrast slightly, and hopefully we'll end up with that image there. And then, although the lens sensor, the camera sensor, sorry, the lens aperture is wide open, I can still see a few bits of dirt. So I'm going to do that. I may endanger removing a couple of stars if I do that. So I'm not going to do too much of it, but remove 1 or 2 of these really obvious ones, like that one I just did, and then this one. You can see that there is a little bit of noise on this image. because obviously if you're shooting at 2000 ISO, then you're likely to get that. I could have removed that in Capture One Pro. I can also remove it here if I can. I use filter and then noise and reduce noise, and hopefully I have it on maximum strength as usual, and we'll see, I hope, that the noise is greatly reduced. So if I undo it, yeah, you can see the noise really comes back. So that's quite an effective way of reducing the noise. Yeah. It does sometimes soften the image slightly. Sometimes, quite often it doesn't, but occasionally it does soften the image slightly, in which case you would then want to sharpen it slightly. But to do that, you would go to Filter, Sharpen, and you would just use a tool called Unsharp Mask, and you can vary the amount you do it. You have various settings here, but I would just use something around about 120, 130 on the amount, and that will sharpen, resharpen the image a little bit if I've lost a little bit of sharpness as a result of removing the noise. But the unsharp masking will not put the noise back in or anything like that. So there we have, hopefully, a completed image. Just the final thing to do now is convert it to an 8-bit file and then save. And there we are. So if I just let's have a look at one more possible file. Let's have a look at the waterfall. So that's actually looking pretty good. I might want to lighten this area in front of me a little bit more, although it's not a particularly attractive part of the picture, so perhaps it's best left a little bit dark. But if I just play around a little bit for a moment, just to see if we can do something with this curve is one that you really play around with a lot to lighten or darken or the image, or increase or decrease the contrast. But I think that's kind of where I would leave the image, and we'll just have a quick look to see if there's any spots of dirt on the picture. With landscape photography, I will also often remove birds from the view, primarily not if they actually look like a bird, but usually a very distant bird just looks like a black splodge, and so it rather spoils the picture. So we'll remove that. There's certainly any spots of sensor dust, and in that so far I can't actually see any bits of sensor dust. So you can see from this, the background of the picture is a little bit blurred, but the foreground is really quite sharp, so it's showing up, which is a little bit soft over to the edges. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a little bit of filter, sharpen, unsharp mask, and that sharpens up the image ever so slightly. So again, image mode, image mode, and then go back to 8 bits and then save that image. So that really is it in terms of processing here. So these are the TIFF files that I processed just earlier. I've ended up with 2 images because obviously I did this one. This is one I did earlier. So what we'll do is we'll take that one out. That's the one I did earlier this afternoon to test everything was working okay. And now obviously what we've got now is a set of files with numbers, well, numbers and letters as their names. So I would often want to just rename these images. So I would highlight or select all the images, all those images that I wanted to rename, and I go to Tools, Battery Name, and I would call it something like Photo Flow Test, something like that. I don't have to do it as one word, but it often is better. One actually will put that as 2 digits there, and that gives me the name, and it gives me a sequence number for each one, and each sequence numbers will consist of 2 digits. So if I then hit rename, then there goes to that photo flow test 0102 to 05. So that's it then really. I will then creates low resolution images for use on the internet and for sort of just record purposes, and then the high res files will then get removed from the computer and stored on 2 external hard drives. So I've got 2 copies of every high resolution TIFF file is stored off the computer in 2 external hard drives. And then that's it, done. quite quick, really, when you're doing 5 or 6 images. When you're doing 500 or 600, it takes rather longer. But that's the way I would. That's the way I work through those 3 programs. That's a hell of a whistle-stop tour of what I try to do. But if I stop sharing my screen now, if anybody has any questions, then please ask away. Obviously, unmute the microphone and ask away. Hi, Stuart.
Have you had a go with just using Lightroom?
No, I don't like. I don't like Lightroom. I find it a bit of a mess trying to do too much within one package, and I don't like it. I've never managed to get on with it. I tried a couple of times, it never got very far. So I stick with the separate bridge, Photoshop, and then the Capture One Pro, which I really do like a lot.
Right.
Yeah.
Jeff here, if I may, Nigel.
Hi, Jeff.
Yeah, back to Bridge. I've been struggling trying to get a good viewer software going. I used to, when I was using Windows, I used Faststone, which I found very good. And now I've just recently moved on to an Apple computer and haven't been so well served. But in Faststone, you could click onto an image and it would just immediately zoom straight into the very spot on the image that you clicked onto.
Oh, right.
And so that was really, really good for sort of bird photography and things like that, which, you know, you're always wanting to check the eyes.
Yeah.
You know, is you know, what's in focus. And I just wondered whether Bridge did that. And also, you know, I try not to use burst mode, partly because I feel I should be able to capture the moment myself.
Yeah.
But also, I absolutely hate getting 20 pictures that are pretty much identical. I'm surely, you know, in theory, one of them should be good. How easily can you kind of compare pictures within Bridge, and how do you go about sorting, you know, your burst if you do use them, or several images that are pretty much the same?
Yeah. Yes, there is a tool on Bridge which is not particularly brilliant, but basically it's like using a loop. So you activate it, and then you can home in on any particular spots or point in the image, and you can move this loop around around the image to check how sharp it is. It doesn't give you a fantastic view of it, but it's not bad. That works reasonably well. Or you can just go into either Capture One or Photoshop and just zoom in a long way on the images there, but obviously one at a time. Then when you do that, that's the problem. Although you can call up several at a time, I suppose. But yeah, and in terms of shooting in bursts, yes, I see far too many photographers doing a sort of like what I call the blunderbuss approach, just or the machine gun approach, and just photographing a bird that's standing stock still, and they shoot about 30 images of it. And it's okay. You want to avoid the very second when the bird blinks, but you don't need to take 30 images to do that. You just take 4 or 5 maybe.
But then it's quite a job sorting. You know, I find it's still quite a job sorting, even though I try not to take too many. You know, try and get the photographs sorted while you're on site, rather than just taking a whole dump of stuff home. Yeah, I still find it's quite hard, you know, sorting through really. And you know, I didn't really see in Bridge your ability to be able to compare images and put them side by side and things like that.
Right.
Is that the case?
Yeah, well, I know what you mean. Well, yes, you can put images side by side on Bridge, so it does work quite well. And you can put this loop onto each one of them as well, so you can compare. But it does still take time, that's for sure. Yeah.
Maybe I should download and have a play. Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Just got a written question from Zerka Pichano. She says about using Canon's own digital professional photo software instead of using Capture One, for example. Yeah, I admittedly I haven't used Canon's DPP for quite a while, but when I did use it in the past, it never really seemed to work brilliantly. The quality of the images it produced was not great, I have to say. I didn't think it was anyway. And it's admittedly it's free with the 40 Canon camera. It comes bundled free, whereas Capture One Pro is quite expensive, that's for sure. But I wasn't really. DPP feels very clunky, and I wasn't really very happy with the end results either. But then again, I haven't actually haven't really had very satisfactory results from it. Oh, and also Carol as well has put in a question as well on written. Can I explain the difference between RAW, TIFF, and JPEG files? Okay, well, RAW is well, TIFF and JPEG are just different image formats, and both TIFF and JPEG can be compressed, but JPEG files can be compressed much more significantly than TIFF. The compression on TIFF is quite small, but you don't have to compress with TIFF. That's the thing about TIFF. You can save the full size file. With JPEG, the convenience of JPEG files is they don't take up anything like as much space as TIFF files is. But the problem is that each time you open and close it, or each time you open, save, and then close a JPEG file, you're in danger of losing image quality because the software is constantly having to guess as to what should be there. So JPEG files can be a problem if you're going to be working on them and closing them quite a lot. So if you don't want to lose image quality and want to be sure of maintaining image quality, you work in TIFFs. The RAW files, RAW is strictly speaking not an image at all. It's actually it's a piece of it's a collection of data, I suppose you'd say, which gets bundled together. Which, when you put it on a computer and into a RAW converter, gets put together to make the image file, either a TIFF or a JPEG. And when you're looking at a RAW file, the image that you're looking at is not actually the final image. It's just a little thumbnail which the raw file data creates for you to actually be able to view the image data that has been collected. But it's not per se an image file in itself. It's a bundle of data that will go to create your image once you start processing it on the computer afterwards, if that makes sense. And the reason for using that, it takes more time to process it on the computer, which is a nuisance. But the reason for doing that is that you can make an awful lot more changes in the computer using the raw file than you can with TIFF and JPEG, and do it without the danger of losing image quality, which is always a danger, most especially with JPEG files. So that's why a lot of people, a lot of professional photographers shoot in RAW and then process the images on the computer afterwards.
Nigel, can I help on that? It's Laurie.
Okay, Laurie. All right.
Yeah, I think I can clarify a little bit. The raw file, what you're doing is cutting out everything that the camera does internally.
Okay.
And what you actually record is what the camera saw.
Sure.
If you take a JPEG file or even a TIFF file out of a camera, you're actually going through the camera computer before you actually store on your own hard drive what you're actually getting.
Yeah, sure. The camera
pre-processed file.
Yeah, the camera. If you shoot in JPEG or TIFF, then the camera processes the image for you, and you get to the image processing done in camera, so to speak. Yeah. Whereas with a raw file, that image processing doesn't get done.
Well, the whole point is, of course, that you now have your choice of how you want the image to look, rather than the camera telling you what it's going to do on some automated or semi-automated guess.
Yeah, that's very true.
That's the way I always think of it.
No, it's a very good way of looking at it. I'd actually thought of it like that, but that is absolutely what happens. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Okay. Any more questions?
Yeah, I noticed on your it's Laurie again.
Hi, Laurie.
Sorry,
that's okay.
I don't want to sort of monopolize this, but
no.
I noticed you use a black or dark grey background in Photoshop and also in your Capture Pro.
Yeah, that's just kind of the default setting, really. I quite like that, but I don't like it black. I prefer a dark grey rather than completely black. And white I find or pale grey I find quite distracting. Rather than sort of, I want the background to just disappear and not really impinge on my consciousness if I can help it.
Right. Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Yeah. Sorry. If no one else is there, it's Laurie again.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Do you actually go to a sort of a desktop printer of any sort to check out your images?
No, I don't, because there's no, for me, there's no need to. I very rarely print anything, actually. I deliberately steered away from the printing thing because
it's a horrible topic, that one.
Where you could have an entire evening talking about that.
Oh, yes.
Because a lot of people complain to me about how the images that come off on their printer look nothing like what they're looking at on the screen. And that, of course, is down to the calibration process. Of course, are you using, is your software using the same color space as your camera? Is your printer using the same color space as your camera? Is your monitor calibrated to the same color space as your software and your printer? Are the inks you're using in the printer the right inks for the calibration? Is the paper you're using the right paper for that printer and for those inks?
Yeah.
If the answer to all those questions is yes, then the images coming off the printer should look exactly the same as the image you're looking at on your computer screen. But if any of those things along that way either is wrong or not done at all, then you will have a problem with matching your output on your printer to what you see on the computer screen, and that's where a lot of people fall down. They either don't have the monitor calibrated for one reason or another, don't realize just how important it is, or another one is they choose to use budget inks. Nothing wrong with budget inks, but don't expect necessarily the prints to. And I use budget inks a lot, but if you want to be sure of the print coming out looking exactly as the image does on the computer screen, then it may not happen, because those inks are not going to be completely calibrated to your printer. And then the paper, each printer has a certain set of papers recommended for that printer, and that's because their color printing profiles is embedded in the software for that printer. And if you go using someone else's paper, then that printer won't have the profile for that paper embedded in it, so you will quite likely get the wrong colors in your final printout. Which brings you to another thing, which if you do buy other paper from another supplier, you should be able to go to that supplier's website and download the profile for that particular set of paper that you've just bought, and load it onto your computer and into your printer driver. And so on and on. It goes on and on.
As you say, it's a big topic.
It's a can of worms. And,
done all that, been there.
Yeah. So for me, printing in my work, printing is not so important. But what is important is being able to go from the image on the camera through my processing to a designer's computer, to the printer's computer, to the printer's printers, to the final book at the end of a chain, and the pictures in that book come out looking exactly as they do on my computer screen. And that's the challenge. And it was a hell of a challenge for several years. When we first made the switch from film to digital, everything went wrong and things just looked terrible. And it took us a number of years, everybody involved in that chain, it took a number of years to work out what it was that we actually had to do, and to actually for the software to actually get there, to actually make it possible and easy to do. But now everything works really well. So if you look at any of the books that I've produced, if you bought any of my books, the ones that we've talked about, Wild Southwest, Beautiful Devon, Beautiful Somerset, etc., they're all produced in that way. Nothing's been printed out along the way to actually make a comparison, to actually check. It's all just gone straight from camera to computer to computer to computer to printer to end book. And so far, fingers crossed, everything has come out looking just exactly right. There you go.
Yeah,
don't fix it.
Yeah.
It is nice when you're working at home and you do press that button for print and it comes out and it looks right. And
it's a big relief and a very gratifying experience as well. Yeah.
The icing on the cake, that is.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So there's another question written by Zed Karapatichana. You finished the flow on Photoshop, but how much of your work is actually done before you get to Photoshop? Most of it, actually. Most of the workflow is done. The Photoshop is used really just for finishing off, just for cleaning up, perhaps that final tweak to the contrast or the saturation, cleaning up any bits of dust from the sensor. I can do that to some extent. I can do that in Capture One Pro as well, but I don't think the tool is quite as good as it is in Photoshop. And straightening horizons, I sometimes do in Photoshop, and sometimes I do it in Capture One Pro. Actually, I often do it in Capture One Pro, but don't quite get it exactly right and end up having to tweak it in Photoshop. So most of the work gets done in Capture One Pro. Things get set up in Bridge. Most of the work gets done in Capture One Pro, and then Photoshop is really just the final tweaking. So most of it gets done before I get to Photoshop.
So are you into using layers and masks and everything like that?
Masks I find a bit tedious. I tend to just use a lasso, and then if I want to be safe, I will then copy that and create another layer. Because you can use layers in Capture One Pro as well. It doesn't work in quite the same way as it does in Photoshop, but you can use layers there too, and I do occasionally, but I generally don't do huge amounts of changes to images. If I'm sort of cutting and pasting between moving things from one image to another to create a composite of some sort, so basically an artificial image, then you're creating layers, using layers, moving things around in layers. So that is for real image manipulation. Then you're working in layers. But if I'm just optimizing an image, then and don't really work with layers very much. Masks I tend to use just simply as a lasso or selected area, which I may or may not then copy and paste to create a layer for that.
The one thing about Photoshop, not Photoshop, Lightroom, it's non-destructive.
Yeah, well, this is non-destructive in the sense that, well, all the changes I make can be reversed if I want to, and I still have the original raw file anyway, and I don't care if I lose what was there before, because I'm creating the image that I want anyway. So,
Okay.
And the raw, even with that raw image, once I've made all the changes on Capture One Pro, I can just hit the reset button and go back to the original raw file anyway. So it doesn't really matter. One of the things to remember about these programs is that there are multiple ways to do the same thing. There's built-in redundancy. So if I do put something one way, there'll be someone else telling you to do it a completely different way. And it's just that whatever you find works for you, and you end up choosing and settling with. So whatever I might choose, whatever I might show you this evening, someone else might tell you something quite different another evening. Yeah. Okay. If anybody has any more questions, because we're over the hour, but if anybody has more questions, just ask. But otherwise, I'll end the talk and wish you all a happy Christmas and New Year. COVID-free Christmas and New Year.
You're gonna do this again next year?
The COVID or the talk?
The talk.
Well, okay, next year's talks. I haven't lined up next year's talks yet, but they're going to be less frequent. But they have been every month up till now for the last year and a bit.
Yeah.
But probably from next year they're going to be every 3 months, I think. So I'm getting really busy. And funny, as the talks get more in depth, I'm having to do more advanced work to prepare for them, and so I'm going to have to sort of make them a little bit less frequent. But they will still happen. So you know, watch the news and watch the newsletter and the website, and I'll certainly be letting you know when the first talk will be in March, or mid or late March, on a Wednesday evening again, and I'll let you know about that fairly soon. Right. Hopefully in the beginning of January, I'll let you know.
Anyway, everybody out there, have a happy Christmas and COVID-free.
Yep.
Yeah, thanks you too. Yeah, thanks Nigel. Very much appreciated.
Very welcome. And talk
Thank
to you in 2022, where we hopefully will be totally safe and free.
Oh, of course. Yeah. See you on the other side. Yeah,
okay.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Okay, Nigel. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.